privilege to have Mark, and I won't say much because we have two people, very qualified people, more than me, to say something about Mark. And the first person is Denny Elliott, and Denny Elliott was the founder of the Center for Ethics. She was the founding director. Now she's a chair of media ethics at the University of South Florida. We're fortunate to, or honored really, to have her come back each year because she kept her house in Lolo, and she teaches a fantastic course that gets the best evaluations I've ever seen. It's on the theory and skills of teaching ethics, and she's got this course down. Now, if you're interested in this course, it will be taught next August, and so keep watching the Center for Ethics website and other announcements, because I think that would be something perhaps many of you would enjoy. So with that, I'm going to sit down and enjoy the evening, and I'll introduce Denny Elliott.
Thank you, Dane.
Yes.
It's really fun to have had the opportunity. Whoops, I'm supposed to use this. All right. It's really fun to have had the opportunity to be at the University of Montana for the long time that I was, and to start the Ethics Center, and then to be able to come back and forth and watch how it evolves and grows. This is just a wonderful university and a wonderful center of ethics, and I'm pleased to be still connected to it through this one-week course that I do every summer. And although I do know Mark a little, I am giving the formal introduction, and then I will be turning it over to Joel. Joel, where are you? And what is your last name? Joel? To Joel Berger, who will be giving a more personal introduction to Mark. So here's the formal introduction. Mark Bekoff is Professor Emeritus of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and is a fellow of the Animal Behavior Society and a former Guggenheim Fellow. In 2000, he was awarded the Exemplar Award from the Animal Behavior Society for major long-term contributions to the field of animal behavior. Mark is also an ambassador for the Jane Goodall's Roots and Shoots program, in which he works with students of all ages, senior citizens and prisoners, and is also a member of the ethics committee of that institute. He's a scholar in residence at the University of Denver's Institute for Human-Animal Connection. Mark's main areas of research include animal behavior, cognitive etiology, and behavior ecology, and has published extensively on animal issues with more than 200 papers and 22 books. I'm not going to go through the full list, but instead we'll focus just on what's occurred since 2007. It's scary long, but stay with me. It's really interesting. Summary of Mark's research on animal emotions, titled The Emotional Lives of Animals, a leading scientist explores animal joy, sorrow, empathy, and why they matter, was published in 2007. A book titled Wild Justice, The Moral Lives of Animals was published in 2009. He is edited a 4-volume encyclopedia on animal-human relationships. He's written on cougars. He's got a book, Animals Matter. A biologist explains why we should treat animals with compassion and respect. He has a children's book called Animals at Play, Rules of the Game. The Animal Manifesto, 6 Reasons for Expanding Our Compassion Footprint. And he is working, you might be surprised to know, on a number of new books, including Ignoring Nature, Animal Losses and What We Must Do About Them, and Rewilding Our Hearts. And he's working with Stephen Kotler on a project dealing with emotional, moral, and spiritual lives of animals. And with that, I will turn it over to Joel Berger. You're supposed to talk into this for the TV.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me in the back? So I'm going to tell you a personal story. When I was about 23, starting graduate school, I went to the University of Colorado, and I was really nervous about this professor who I was going to meet. So I went up to the Student Union building, hung out, saw somebody who I was sure wasn't a professor. This guy slightly older than me, big beard, hat, and I asked him where the biology building was. He told me he was going there, he would take me. So as we're walking, he asked me what I was doing, why I was going to the biology building. I said, well, I'm trying to meet this guy named Mark Bekoff. He's a professor. And the guy turns to me and he goes, hey, I'm Mark. So that's how I met Mark. Mark was a great advisor. He invested in me, spent lots of time with me, a little bit of time in the field, came out and visited, gave me some insights. But when it came to data, he was very, very vested. Subsequently, I left, graduated, moved on. And as I reflect back, very rarely in one's life do they run into a person who shapes what they do, other than perhaps a spouse or somebody very, very close. Well, Mark has done that with me, and he's done that in lots of different ways. The way he carries himself with some casualness, but seriousness. He takes his work seriously himself. He's not self-inflated. Mark also is inspirational. He mixes the pot a bit. His name is out there. He believes, he acts, he follows his beliefs. And in one way or another, he's shaking things up by making people think. And so I'm really, really delighted that I'm here, that he has been my mentor, and that I have an opportunity to introduce him.
Thank you. Okay, so who do I introduce? Is this working? So I'm supposed to remind you, hold it up, I'll just do it right now. For Footloose, Montana, there will be a Montana trap-free public lands. There's going to be a sign-up. God, that light is scary. I just had a glass and a half of wine.
If you step forward,
What's that?
I was experimenting with it. If you step forward, it gets a little better.
Oh, okay. That's great. Well, thanks for coming and thanks for having me here. It's really great to be here and to reconnect with Joel. I thought Joel was going to be in the Arctic, and I ran into him at a restaurant last night. So that was really nice. And thanks to the Ethics Center for having me. And thank you for coming out on a... So anyway, what I would like to do tonight is talk to you about the emotional and the moral lives of animals and why they matter. And this is a new book that I'm writing now. It's about taking the notion of rewilding and rewilding ourselves and our hearts, not only the landscapes, and building corridors of compassion and coexistence. And, you know, I think some of the things I'll say tonight may move you out of your comfort zone, but I think that's okay. They move me out of my comfort zone sometimes. But I think if we're going to make a change in how we interact with animals, then we need to move out, that's great, I guess, out of our comfort zones, okay? It's just the way life goes. You know, if you like where you're at and you want to dig yourself a hole and stay there, that's great. But change won't come if we just play that everything is okay with animals and the earth. So I'll be talking about some areas that are probably familiar to some of you, but not to others. So this is kind of, first couple of slides are almost to summarize where I'm going to go, just to lay the groundwork, because I think some of what I'll talk about will be new to you. So some of the questions that I ponder daily through the night when I'm sleeping and when I'm awake is, what do animals feel about what's happening to them? And the question that might motivate my research is, what is it like to be a dog? Or what is it like to be a wolf or a lion or a mosquito? Fill in your favorite animal. And what does it feel like to be that animal? Okay, so what is it like? How do they live their lives? And then what does it feel like to be an animal? And what is their point of view? Animals have a point of view. They like things that we like, and they tend to not like things that we don't like. Okay? Why do we continue to slaughter and silence sentience? And sentience is just sort of a word, you know, philosophers write tons of books about it, but, you know, the ability to feel pain, to be conscious, to know what's going on. So when we talk about sentient beings, we're talking about animals who have some sense of self, if you will, and feel pain and suffer. So why do we feel free to slaughter it and silence it? Why do we do invasive things in the name of science or food, clothing, or entertainment? And why do we allow those things to happen? What are the ethical questions we need to ask? And as a scientist, I'm very concerned with the notion of what's called good welfare. So a lot of my colleagues will say, well, I'm doing the best I can. I'm practicing good welfare. But I'll show you some slides to show that good welfare isn't good enough. Okay? So why good welfare isn't good enough when we use animals and when we redecorate nature? And what I mean by redecorate nature, that light is following me, basically we move into the homes of animals and we redecorate their homes. It's like, oh, wouldn't wolves look good here? Or wouldn't coyotes look good here? Or wouldn't a TV look good in the den? So we do redecorate nature. And I like using that word because it makes us think about how we move into the living rooms of animals, and then we do what we want, and then when they become pests, we get rid of them. Okay? So we need to really think about that. How can we enrich the lives of animals? How can we build these corridors of compassion and coexistence? And this idea that I've been developing a lot is called the compassion footprint, to sort of counter the carbon footprint, which is the subtitle of my new book, The Animal Manifesto. And this should work. Yes! I'm not a tech freak. Okay, so some people will say, well, you know, we really love animals, but, you know, their lives don't mean as much to them as our lives mean to us. And one of my favorite quotes comes from Elizabeth Costello, who is actually a person, an actress, if you will, in James Coetzee's book, The Lives of Animals. And I know you can read, but anyone who says that life matters less to animals than it does to us has not held in his hands an animal fighting for its life. The whole of the being of the animal is thrown into that fight without reserve. Animals like to avoid pain. They have an interest in living, just like we as animals have an interest in living. And of course, the local stuff, you know, that's going on with wolves, you know, the shooting of wolves, should they be protected, should they not be? I'm going to get into this in a bit. And the important thing that I call the Animal Manifesto is animals are asking us to treat them better or leave them alone. Except for our domesticated animals, you know, animals do pretty well without us. They've been here for a long time without us, and they could probably go on and be happy a long time without us. So just some shots, because I knew I was coming up to a country where there's just a lot of divided views on wolves, and I think people really need to listen to both sides of what's going on. But, you know, what are these animals, or what were these animals feeling? What do they want? I was very concerned about the reintroduction of lynx into Colorado, because it wasn't like I was against putting lynx back in southwestern Colorado, but the original reintroduction program was very poorly run. It was hastily organized, as the Colorado Division of Wildlife admitted later on, and 4 out of the first 5 animals died of starvation. It's not a pretty death. I mean, no death is going to be pretty that way. So we protested it, and they ultimately changed the way in which they released the animals and reduced the death rate. Okay? This is a quote from a wonderful article in Men's Journal in January 2008. It's somebody from Wildlife Services, who you know are basically hired to kill animals. It says, "No one wants you to see this shit," said a Wildlife Services agent who shoots coyotes for a living. It's a killing floor. So there is dissension within these organizations, and I think it's just something that we need to recognize. And these are 2 wolves who were shot a year or 2 ago in Idaho, being held up, okay, by their feet. So some general points. We're a conceited lot. You know, basically human beings are big-brained, invasive mammals. That's who we are, and we can do anything we want, and we just roam around and do whatever we want. Another general point is that animals depend on our goodwill and our best intentions. And what blows my mind is that people who care about animals or the environment are called the radicals. But why is it radical or extreme to care about animals and care about the environment? Wouldn't it be nice if the people who harmed animals and harmed the environment were the radicals? So I'm going to end off on a very positive note, but I just find that to be bizarre. We don't have to be apologists for caring and feeling, and we don't have to feel badly for feeling. I interact with students, and they'll say, oh, I was in a laboratory, or I was reading about some experiment, and I got really emotional about it. And my professor said, oh, well, you can't be a biologist if you're going to be sentimental. But I actually think that the world will become a better place when scientists have compassion, and that science will be better for the compassion. So I just try to tell students, you don't have to apologize for caring, and you're not the radicals. Okay? We need a paradigm shift, a huge social change. Caring about animals doesn't mean caring less about humans, because I believe that compassion begets compassion. The more compassion you put out into the world, excuse me, the more there will be. And when people say that, this is a little girl named Molly Amu who I've adopted in Uganda. So I care about people. I don't do a lot of work for people, but it doesn't mean I don't care about them. So when people say, oh, look at all the people problems, why are you wasting your time about animals? That is because if we lose more animals, and the loss of animals that's going on now is driving people crazy. It really is. People don't realize that they really miss animals until we wake up one morning and we go, well, where have all the animals gone? And that's something that even if you talk to people about, the loss of animals, and people who don't really think a lot about animals, when they start thinking about why they get down, is sort of like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. They don't hear bird songs. They don't see animals running across their path when they're hiking. So they miss it, but they don't know it. So I think that this is something that's really important to keep in mind. When people tell me they love animals and harm them or kill them, I say, I'm glad they don't love me. We have a really conflicted relationship. It's frustrating, it's challenging, it's paradoxical. And I mean this seriously. We need to work this out before we lose the animals who mean so much to us. When people say they're not sure if dogs or other animals are emotional beings, I say, I'm glad I'm not their dog. And then I ask people, would you do it to your dog? Would you do to your dog what you do or allow to be done to other animals? It's really important to factor in what you allow to be done. Because somebody will say, well, I don't do that. But in a sense, if you allow it to be done and you don't protest it or fight against it, then you're part of the problem, if you will. And then one big thing for me, it's among others, but in terms of the amount of cruelty in the world is unparalleled in, say, factory farming. So I ask people, would you trade places with a cow or a pig on a factory farm, or would you let your dog go to a factory farm? And they'll go, oh, no, I'd never do that. Well, then why do you allow a cow or a pig to go? They're sentient beings who feel pain. So it's not like you want to be in people's faces, but I think these are difficult questions that need to be answered as we head on, because the amount of destruction for which we're responsible is really, really high. So what can we learn from animals? They do depend on our goodwill. Animals show a lot of fairness, cooperation, and empathy, and trust and forgiveness. I'll talk about this later, but I want to tell you where I'm coming from. Animals are basically honest. Cheating is extremely rare. Do animals deceive one another? They do, but they don't do it all the time. There's a limit to how much an individual animal can get away with before he or she is labeled a cheater in a group, and other animals won't interact with them. There's survival value to being fair and light. Stress kills human beings and animals. And this is something that is the bottom line to my book, The Animal Manifesto. Is that animals and human animals, if you will, are born to be good. I believe that we've really been co-opted by media, and by a misinterpretation of the true nature of animals. They do fight with one another, they do compete with one another, but they're also good to one another. Bob Sussman, who's a very well-known primatologist, and his colleagues went through the literature and they summarized data from the behavior of various primates, from great apes to New World monkeys and Old World monkeys, prosimians, found that more than 90% of their behavior is positive or what we call prosocial. People go, well, animals go to war with one another. In the 50 years, this is the 50th year that Jane Goodall's been studying chimpanzees in Gombe in Tanzania, she's only seen one instance of this warfare. But what happens is it catches your attention, and then all of a sudden it just gets blown up. So do animals sometimes behave cruelly to one another? Yeah, sometimes they do, but it's actually very, very rare. So where I'm going to go, and I'm going to come full circle, is that there's a lot of goodness out there, but for some reason, we just want to really hook on to the badness. You know, so when people say, oh, you're acting like an animal, I go, well, thank you. I mean, that's just great. It's a compliment. I teach a course in jails, and when the prisoners turn around and go, oh man, how did you do that? You're acting like an animal. I'll always say, well, you just gave that guy a big compliment. So I want you to think about that, because I'm going to come back to it. So I know sometimes you just have to show a slide and make people laugh. Especially, I'm not a night person. I could easily be asleep now, so do laugh. So it's really important, that I think of the Woody Guthrie song, this land is our land, this land is my land. Well, this land is their land too, okay? The only point I want to make off of this slide, there's two or 3 points, is that one of the real challenges for the future, I think, is how we get people who are interested in ecosystems and populations and species to work with people who are interested in the well-being or the protection of individuals. So people who are generally interested in animal protection concern themselves with the health or the well-being of individuals. People who are interested in, say, the health or well-being of larger entities like, say, ecosystems, think, well, it's too bad if an animal individual has to die for the good of their species or to keep an ecosystem alive, but it's permissible. And so I used to just sort of blow it off thinking, oh no, we really can't deal with that. But the real world out there is we need to deal with it. So I do work with conservation groups and environmentalists to try to just get them to think about animals as individuals. So it's a challenge for the future, okay? That, if you will, dichotomy is not going to go away, okay? So I want you to think about that. And the other thing that I'm very concerned about is what I call the eradicate or kill, restore, and eradicate cycle. And that's what's happening with wolves, and that's what happens with a lot of animals who are reintroduced. Humans get rid of them. Humans bring them back. It's thought that they're thriving. They reach sustainable levels, whatever you want to call it, and then we kill them again. Okay? So not only is there an ethical question there, I mean, it's a serious ethical question, but it's a question of why are we doing it? It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. Would the money be better off being put into preserving habitat than bringing back animals who then we allow to be killed? Okay, so I think this is something that we need to face. It moves people in and out of comfort zones, but I do think it's something that we really need to face. And the other thing that I think is very important to consider is talking about alien versus native species. Okay, we are responsible in large part for the invasion into habitats of alien species. An alien individual doesn't feel less than a native individual. So that's an example where one might make a choice to kill an alien animal, silence sentience, if you will, for the good of native species. Okay? I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong way. I'm just saying we need to ponder these questions before things just get out of control. And they do make you uncomfortable. They make me uncomfortable. I hope they would make you uncomfortable. Now, one of the main arguments I use in my work is called the argument of evolutionary continuity. This is a dog reading Darwin's book, just going, oh my goodness, if Darwin weren't a real animal, he wouldn't be surprised by what he discovered. But it's good biology to take the view that other animals have very rich and deep emotional lives and also some moral intelligence. And I'll talk about this. What Charles Darwin basically said is that the differences among species are differences in degree rather than differences in kind. And when you boil that down, what it means is that the differences among species are shades of gray rather than black and white. There's a continuum, evolutionary continuity. So to me, the bumper sticker from the argument for evolutionary continuity is if we have something, humans, other animals have it. So if we have a sense of morality, so do they. We need to learn what theirs is. It may not resemble ours, but that's okay. If we have rich and deep emotions that range from joy and grief and resentment and jealousy and embarrassment, so do they. And we need to learn about their emotional lives. So we can't say, well, their emotions aren't identical to ours, so therefore they don't have them, because we could say that therefore we don't have them. But as a biologist, you wouldn't expect that, okay? Of the people in this room, like if there's n people, there's probably n minus 10 similarities in joy and grief. People grieve differently, they show joy differently, but it would be wrong to say that if you don't show joy like I do, or you don't grieve like I do, that I do and you don't, or you do and I don't. And I think it's very, very important to remember that as a biologist. There's no reason to think that animals have to have, quote, the same feelings that we do, because we don't have the same feelings across the board. Now, one criticism that you hear a lot, I'm going to dispense with it really fast, is, I'm sure people in here have heard this too, is people say, oh, you're just being anthropomorphic. And anthropomorphism is in a simple way, is just attributing human qualities, anthropoid ape qualities, to non-human animals. But we also attribute those characteristics to thunderstorms. People talk about angry thunderstorms, okay? But the last I checked, like, thunderstorms weren't sentient and weren't moral agents. But we use these words. So after, a really long time of pondering the criticism and people going, oh, you're just being anthropomorphic, I was at a meeting and we were talking about the well-being of elephants in captivity. And I realized that when I say that an elephant isn't happy, my critics say, oh, you're being anthropomorphic. She's doing just fine. She's happy. And then there's, I know, and then there's this silence, and you get that old blank phenomenon. So why is it anthropomorphic to say that an elephant alone in a cage is miserable, but it's not anthropomorphic to say that she's happy? So I just call it anthropomorphic double talk. You can call it anthropomorphic dribble. I don't care what you call it. But the fact of the matter is, traditionally, people are a lot more permissive to say that an animal is happy than she's sad, but it usually comes from people who exploit animals. Okay? This came from a debate I was in with some people from the Association for Zoos and Aquariums. And it was really amazing because after this guy said, oh, she's happy, you're just being anthropomorphic, there was this pin drop silence. And I was thinking that, and he said, well, maybe it's time for an intermission. So I just put it aside. Really, if you believe in evolutionary continuity, if you believe that if we have something, they have something, then we're not inserting something human into animals that they don't have. Okay? I tell my students, if someone says you're being anthropomorphic, just say, fine, do you have anything else to say? Because it's a deflection away from the real issues. I mean, you can spend your lifetime debating anthropomorphism, or you can accept the fact that animals have emotional lives and we need to study them and not, if you will, trump their interests with our interests. Where are the data? Well, this is about as scientific as I care to get tonight, but all mammals share the same structures in a part of the brain called the limbic system that are important for feelings. There's a structure called the amygdala. It's a small little structure. All mammals have it, and it's important in processing emotions and in feeling, if you will. And there's a little picture of it over here. So what are some surprises? Well, I'm not surprised at these, but what could be some surprises? We know that mice display empathy. So there was a scientific study done, published in the prestigious journal Science, where most of my colleagues, if they published one paper in Science over their career, would be happy. So the reason I'm saying that is that a lot of articles on animal emotions are being published in really prestigious peer-reviewed professional journals, Science, Nature, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So we know that mice show empathy. Mice show a lower threshold to pain when they see another animal in pain. Well, that surprised some people, but if you've ever been around mice who weren't living in horribly impoverished cages in a laboratory, you'd know that they're social beings and they care for one another. We also knew that in 1964, a study was done that showed that rats would not eat if when they ate, another rat got shocked. So if a rat associated another animal being shocked, they wouldn't take food, and the same for monkeys. So what I'm saying is that these studies were done so long ago, people didn't have the paradigm into which to place the results, okay? But we've known this for years. Another big finding a couple of years ago was that at least 4 species, but more now, of whales have what are called spindle cells. And spindle cells are important in processing emotions. So until the spindle cells were discovered in whales, it was thought, of course, that who is the only species who has them? Us.
Of course.
Of course. Turns out that when biologists look at the size of a brain, what they usually do is they scale it to the body size, and they come up with a ratio because, of course, an elephant's brain or a whale's brain is much larger than a brain of a human or a mouse. But when you scale the size of the brain to the size of the body, turns out that whales have more spindle cells and they're evolutionarily older. Hello? So what I'm saying is that every day we're discovering new things about the emotional lives of animals. Now, one thing, as I know, I love this slide, as an ethologist, is try to get people to think about the way in which animals communicate with one another. So we're visual animals, and we spend a lot of time talking about visual signals. But of course, if you live with a dog or a cat or other animals, you know they communicate using other modalities, other senses, like, particularly hearing and olfaction. So we don't hear ultrasound of bats. We don't hear the infrasound of elephants and whales who can communicate over tens of kilometers or thousands of kilometers through the water. Okay, so I try to make people or get people to think about this. So for example, animals like pigs or cows, food animals, rats and mice, lab animals who aren't protected from invasive research, don't have to see another animal to know that they're suffering. They can smell and hear the suffering. So not only do individuals in these situations experience their own suffering, it's exacerbated or magnified by the suffering of others. So this is just something that's really important to think about. And some people go, well, are animals discriminating? And my attitude is, yes, animals are extremely discriminating. I've shown this in Texas at least 5 times, and I'm still alive. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that animals really, really communicate well with one another. They have very sophisticated communication systems, and that we can't only sort of project our own visual view of the world onto them. Okay, that would be, like I teach that in my animal behavior course. As an ethologist, we need to think about that. Why do dogs wish they could pee on everything in the world? I mean, if I were a dog, it would be great if I could just pee anywhere I wanted to. And in fact, they do often. But that's the way in which they express themselves and communicate. So some pictures. I mean, one of the things I think is really important, and I know that I'm preaching to a lot of you in the audience would be preaching to the converted. Maybe there are some skeptics here. So I kind of see my role and people who study animal behavior as not trying to twist your arm to make a change, but just put the information out there and let you make the choices that you make. Okay? So that's why it's great, you pick up the New York Times, and it's almost, at least once a week, there's an article in there about the wonderful world of animals. Okay? So it's just great to put the information out there. And one of the things that we're really missing is interacting with animals. I was talking to Joel this morning at breakfast, professionally, is, people jump into modeling, and they do all these things, and they don't have the foggiest idea of what they're putting into the models. Okay, so is it surprising that a lot of models of behavior or ecology or models that are used in conservation don't work? No, it's not surprising at all because people don't know what the animals do. So it's really important to watch animals, have really basic information, and then for those people who don't study animals, who have the opportunity to get close to animals, it's important to interact with animals in one way or another. I'm just going to show you a bunch of slides that make that point. This is a koala bear who was just parched and totally dehydrated from the fires around Melbourne, Australia in January 2008. This is not a photoshopped picture. And wild animal came down, and this is one of the firefighters giving him water. And I was in New Zealand a couple of months ago, and it turns out this animal died of stress. So the one point that's really important is what you see is not necessarily what the animal is experiencing internally. I mean, I know that this is simplistic sometimes, but you got to think about this. Okay, this animal was rescued, behaved as a happy-go-lucky koala bear, however they behave, died, and when they did the autopsy, he's just totally stressed out. His organs were gone from the fire. It's my friend Larry Dorfman who rescues bears in Texas. Sometimes what happens is people who are working for animals, you feel alone. You just feel that, well, you have friends, but once you get out of your close-knit circle, you're alone. It turns out there's a lot of wonderful people around the world working for animals, and you're not alone. But sometimes you just feel isolated about this. It's a woman outside of the slums in Nairobi, Kenya. I've been there, and I mean, they're terrible, terrible places, and there were riots there. And she was told that she could go back to her home, which was probably no bigger than this table, and get something that's of value, and she's got her cat. Now, she didn't own a lot of things, but she ran back, grabbed her cat, and ran. Dedication, connection. Some of you have probably seen this. This is a horse who was a survivor of Katrina, who was then bitten by a dog, and instead of putting the horse down, a veterinarian made a prosthesis. So it's just sort of going that little extra step, being concerned with individuals. Like in the grand scheme of things, one can say, well, does the life of that horse really make a difference? Well, I think the life of the horse makes a difference, but yeah, maybe his life doesn't make a difference in a global perspective. But I think when you see examples of this, you begin to think as an individual what you can do to work for the well-being of individual animals. So I know I have the same shirt on. I always wear the same clothes, and people think, but I actually have a dozen of these T-shirts. Same bracelet, too. No, it's scary, actually. Same shoes. Uh-oh, I'm not going any further. Anyway, I was in Budapest, Hungary, and I was with Adam McCloskey here, who does a lot of work studying the similarities and the differences between wolves and dogs, because basically all dogs have evolved from wolves. And so went into an enclosure. This is a European wolf, not a coyote. I kept thinking, Adam, what do you have coyotes here? But when you see them in person or in wolf, you notice they're leggier and they're skinnier. And I said, will I be okay? And he said, yeah, I think so. And when somebody says, I think so, you kind of, well, you know, I ride my bike a lot, and if I say, is there a car coming, and someone says, I think it's okay, you kind of don't think it's okay. You want to make sure it's okay. So I walked into the enclosure, I just sat down, and after about a half hour, this male came over, and he just took my entire ear into his mouth. And I'm sort of sitting there going, I'm not sure. And the woman, you can't see her, but her name's Doti, who works there, said, you know, you'll be okay. Let's go visit another animal. So this was a rescue center, and this is a European brown bear. And I said to Doti, like, could I go in with him? And her answer was the same, well, I think so. And I thought, okay, you know, a wolf, well, you know, do a little damage. This guy was big. So I just sat there and I looked at him, and he came over, and we made eyes with one another. And basically, she then went in and played with him. And she said, you know, you want to join me? And I went, no. I've got a flight in 2 days. Oh, I want to walk to the airline, not be carried. But it was just amazing. You know, I've been close to bears in the wild at my house in Colorado, black bears. Never been that close to a grizzly or a brown bear. This is a coyote. Last year we had like an education seminar in Denver, and this was a male whose family was killed, sole survivor, and was being rehabbed. You know, it was just taking the time to get to meet these animals. This is Bessie. Bessie is a dairy cow on Farm Sanctuary in Northern California. She and I really bonded. I mean, she felt safe. And this is Geraldine, a pot-bellied pig. So I'll give you an example of what you can do. This is an example of a very wealthy man, but you don't need the money. It's a man named David Grubman who lives in Boulder. He's my neighbor. He's very wealthy, and he took $3 million of his own money and formed a ranch called Kindness Ranch near, between Casper and Cheyenne, Wyoming. He rescues laboratory animals, and they're all adoptable out. So he's got horses, Premarin horses, horses who have been used for Premarin, dogs, cats, hamsters, pigs, and cows, and they each get a yurt. It's really cool. So and they've got an outdoor run. So the reason I just say this, like if you just Google Kindness Ranch, you'll just see the sorts of things that people can do. He had no idea whether this would work. He's got tons of animals. They're all adoptable out. We bring kids up there to work with the animals. They learn the animals. They clean them up. They groom them. And this is their connection with animals into the future. And this was a chimpanzee named Yuri who very deep psychological problems and would always walk around with a blanket on his head. And this was at a primate sanctuary in Texas. And I really, really wanted to befriend him. And Lee Watt, who runs it, said, I don't know if you can, just sit with him. So I sat with him and I started reading from my book, The Emotional Lives of Animals, and I could tell that Yuri was going, oh, give me a break here. I mean, like, would I have the audacity to write a book called The Emotional Lives of Humans? So after 4 hours, it's getting late, and I just started getting up, and Lee came down, and she stopped, and she kept like this, pointing, and I turned around, and Yuri touched my finger. Now, I gave this talk once, and somebody said, who gives a shit whether Yuri touched your finger? Well, I really gave a blank. It was really cool, and the next day I went down to see him, and it didn't take 4 hours. It took a few minutes, and he came forth. The point is we need to connect with animals. We just need to. Now, in terms of my research, the questions I would ask would be, do you think this is a happy dog and why? And what do you think that dog is thinking or feeling? So let me just tell you about some research. I think that's a happy dog, okay? I think that if you went in and you did an MRI or you did some recordings from his amygdala, you would see the same joy and pleasant feelings that you might have with a human knocking down a margarita on a cold or warm afternoon, okay, or jumping into a swimming pool. So what is this dog thinking? Is that dog envious? Does that dog, is saying, I wish I could have what he's having? Well, turns out there's some recent research done. One study was done on capuchin monkeys. If you have two capuchin monkeys together, you can train them to do a certain task, and you give them monkey chow, and that's the reward, okay? And then you change the name of the game, and you give one of the monkeys a date or a grape, a more valued, tastier food, and the other capuchin monkey refuses to do the task. The study was done on dogs just last year. Have two dogs next to one another so they can see one another, obviously smell and hear one another, but I think it's sight. Train them to shake. You don't have to be Albert Einstein to get a dog to shake. Give them a dog treat. And then change the reward for one and give them a marrow bone or something more salient, and the dog getting the dog treat refuses to shake. So let's see what's going on there. Scientists call this inequity aversion. It's an aversion to being treated unfairly, okay? And it's been written, these studies were published, one of these studies was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a really prestigious place where, they just wouldn't publish junk. So where can we go with this? And I'm going to spend a bit of time on this because I think it's important. So I was asked when the study came out on dogs, am I surprised about this? And my answer was no. If you watch packs of wild coyotes or wolves or other social animals, they're constantly looking at one another and assessing what's going on. They spend 90 or more % of the time just hanging out, lying down or sleeping, watching. So they're assessing what's going on. And if you look at the details of the behavior and you actually get off your butt and you watch what the animals are doing, you'll see that they don't want to be treated unfairly. Okay? And so I wasn't surprised. It was interesting to see this, and it would be very difficult to do this kind of study in the field. But the answer would be, maybe that dog is envious, or maybe that dog wants that ball. And the data that are coming out now on other species that are being studied for inequity aversion is really showing very carefully, very clearly, that animals do monitor what other animals are getting and then change their behavior and will not work for less reward. I think there's one species who does that routinely. Okay? So once again, with respect to evolutionary continuity, if we do it, there's no reason to think they don't. Do you think that's a happy dog? I think that that's a happy dog. I think if you went in and you did an MRI or you took some of the chemicals like dopamine, you'd think that that would be a happy dog. Do animals love one another? You get this all the time, and humans are just not the right species to be holding court on the notion of love. I mean, really, let's just face that. So these are a male and a mommy and a daddy, a male and a female, who mated for at least 5 years. They traveled with one another. They defended territory, food, raised young together. When they were apart, they showed that they were anxious. When they were together, they're more content. When they mated each year, they actually courted. The male didn't just plop on the female and say, let's do it. So they actually had a really good relationship. Do I think that that's love? Yeah, I think that that's love. Why not? So a lot of my colleagues will go, well, animals, quote, love one another. And I'm thinking, well, what is quote love? Well, maybe that's for humans is quote love. But there's a really tight bond there. So I'm serious, so people say, well, how can you study, emotions? Well, you can go out and you can collect data, just like I was telling you. Do the animals travel with one another? Do they sleep with one another? Do they defend food and territory with one another? Do they cooperatively breed, et cetera, et cetera? And if you start answering yes to those questions, what do you have? You have a very tight bond. The animals miss one another, and we would call that love. So why can't we use that word? It's not being anthropomorphic, okay? So I'm just saying that if you get out and do the right studies, you can study this. Do animals have a sense of awe, wonder, or mystery? This is a male chimpanzee. Jane Goodall has observed on occasion, it's usually males at waterfalls doing what she calls the waterfall dance. And it's like a Southern Baptist revival. Their hair goes up, their eyes roll back, and they just look like they're doing hallelujah. No, they do. And I'll tell you a story because I've actually got the opportunity to see this. So Jane wonders, and once again, I do a lot of work with theologians, and it's fun work. You know, do animals have spiritual lives? Well, if we'd have them, then they might. You know, I mean, we just have to sort of delve in and figure out what it might be to have a spiritual life for a chimpanzee. They definitely have the neural endowment to have the spiritual life. So Jane and I were at a chimpanzee sanctuary called the Mona Sanctuary in Girona, Spain, north of Barcelona. And we were just hanging out there, and I mean, I don't get to see chimpanzees a lot. I've never seen a chimpanzee in the wild. And, you know, so Jane and I were talking, and we were watching the chimpanzees, and just as we were leaving, thunderstorm came up, and the woman came and grabbed us, and there was a chimpanzee named Marco who was having one of these, if you will, out of chimpanzee body experiences. I mean, there was a thunderstorm, and he was running back and forth. He was flailing his arms. His eyes were rolled back. His hair was up. And I swear, if you just saw the silhouette and you didn't know that Marco was a chimpanzee, you would have thought you were at some Hallelujah Revival meeting. So the question, though, as a biologist, I would ask is, what is going on, or what was going on in Marco's brain? What is going on in these animals, okay? So it's, once again, people may think that these are frivolous questions, or sometimes I say, well, you live in Boulder, Colorado, so it's normal that you would think that way, you know, come on up to Missoula. But the fact of the matter is, these are real questions that you can really ask. So I'm actually going to a meeting in Norway in a few months. They're going to be talking about comparative religions, and they're going to be talking about animal models. And they're going to be talking about why did religion and maybe spiritual lives evolve, and what would be the analog in animals. It's fascinating to me. So anyway, there's a lot going on. An angry baboon who I met in the Masai Mara. Okay, and so this baboon just did not like me. And the guide kept saying to me, Mark, don't go too close. And I'm thinking, like, you know, I'm not the brightest bulb on the block, but I'm not dumb. But it was really interesting as a couple of other people got out of the van and walked towards the baboon. His demeanor really changed. So, you know, once again, I know you know this, but it's just really interesting to see the variation in behavior. This animal was really discriminating. So there's been fascinating work done by a man with the unpronounceable name of Khan Slobodchikov, who studies Gunnison's prairie dogs. Turns out that Gunnison's prairie dogs have an amazing communication system, syntax, semantics. They discriminate among individuals. So I'm just throwing that out there. It took years for him to gather these data, and the data that he's gathering rival what we know about, if you will, language in the great apes. So once again, it's just a matter of getting out and doing the research. What is this elephant doing and feeling? Okay, these are elephants in Samburu in northern Kenya who I met, and it's Gracie and Eleanor. Eleanor ultimately died, but like, what is happening here? What's going on in Gracie's brain? What's going on in this picture of a dead baby? All the elephants coming around, touching the elephant, the corpse basically, with their trunk. Standing vigil, their whole demeanor. And the very first day that I went into the field with a man named Ian Douglas Hamilton. Some of you might know his name. You know, people call him the Jane Goodall of, you know, elephants. I mean, he's been up there for 40 some odd years. And I had never seen an elephant in the wild until I arrived there. I guess I'd seen them, but at a distance. And there was a group of elephants, and they were walking around just like this, really sulking. Their bodies were low, their tails were down, their ears were down, their trunks were down. And I just said to Ian, I said, there's something wrong here. And he said, yes, the matriarch, who's like the social glue of the group, had recently died. And a couple of kilometers down the road, there was another group of elephants who were just romping around and playing with one another. Okay, so it's a real good question. What are these animals thinking? What are they feeling when they go through these really incredible rituals? This picture was shown around the world. Gorilla named Ghana carrying in the Hamburg Zoo her dead baby. I don't think you need to be a professional ethologist or student of animal behavior, and I mean this seriously, to show that she's not a happy camper. And I'm sure that if someone went in and took a blood sample, or once again could do some of the research that we might do on humans, you would find the precise physiological mechanisms that are going on. Okay, we just need to do it. Magpies. A couple of years ago, is Rod here? No. It's so funny, I have a good friend who now lives in Missoula, and I had dinner with him last night. And Rod and I were riding our bicycles back into Boulder, and we came around a corner, and there was a dead magpie in the middle of a road with four or five other magpies around the corpse. And so I just stopped, and one magpie went in and pecked at the corpse and backed up. Another did. They stood. One magpie flew off, brought back pine needles, and laid it right by the corpse. Another did. And then they stood around the circle, and I was kind of delirious from a long bike ride, so I was glad Rod was there. And they stood around the circle, and I say imperceptibly, but it wasn't really imperceptibly. They stood there, they went like this, and they all flew off. So like I'm sitting there going, oh my God, and Rod is sitting there saying, did you see that? Did you see that? Oh, you must see that all the time. You study animals. I'd never seen that. So I published this, and to date, this was probably 6 or 7 years ago, I've had over 100 emails with people writing that the corvids, they've seen the same kind of ceremony in magpies, crows, and ravens. I, about 2 months ago, got an email from a woman in England who had seen the same thing in sparrows. So the point I want to make here is that, are these things rare? They might be rare. But we don't know if they're rare. They might happen when you're not around. So for example, about, probably 7 or 8 years ago, I was driving my car up my road. I live in the mountains outside of Boulder. And on 3 occasions, I've been as close to cougars as I am to this. Not intentionally. But on one of them, I was driving up my road at midnight. It's really pitch black. And I see this large tan animal running towards my car. And I'm thinking it's Lolita, who was my neighbor's German Shepherd. And so I stopped the car. And as I stopped the car and I opened the door, I hear Lolita barking behind me. And I go, oh! I had actually opened the car door into a cougar. So I drove up the road. And I have to walk about 50 meters down to my house. And I didn't see the cougar come up the road, and I was probably just wishing he hadn't. So I sprinted down, and man, I was really scared, The next day I went out, and I looked down the road, because I didn't know, there's cougars around all the time, but I didn't know why or what happened. And I saw, turned out to be a female red fox, basically burying and doing a ritual around the corpse of her mate. We knew who the foxes were because they'd been mating up the road for years and they had pups. And she was digging, looking, peering, stamping down dirt, pine needles, twigs, moved over like this. I just watched this and I was just amazed. She was going through an incredible burial ceremony. So I wrote that up, and then I started getting emails from people who have seen things like that in wolves. So the point I'm trying to make is that these things happen. We're not always out there to see them. And then when you put it out there, and the internet is just like a viral, literally for some, you get information about that. Now what about science? Okay, so I'm a scientist and I like doing science. Somebody gave me this T-shirt after a talk, so I just had to put it on. But what about science? Let me make a couple of comments. I think science is great. I think I love doing science. I wish that a lot of scientists would clean up their acts, not only in terms of how they treat animals, but in terms of fessing up what we don't know or what we do know. But I think science is only one way to access other animals. there's indigenous knowledge, and I actually put a lot into just intuition. I just do. Can we be wrong? Yes. Can science be wrong? Yes. Oh, that's my phone. I'm serious. I was telling them on the way over here. It's for Elise, by the way. It's embarrassing because everybody's supposed to shut their phone off, and nobody ever calls me. Good. So anyway, science. So I think we need to be more honest about what we know. And I also think scientists have an immense responsibility for sharing what we know and we don't know with the public, and for getting out there and taking certain positions. Like, I think today we were talking about how hard it is to get scientists to come and, say, testify at hearings about wolves. That's not unique, believe me. And it's not only in America. You know, so I always feel that, well, I'm fortunate enough to have the life I have to study animals, a lot of which is supported by taxpayers' money. So I have an obligation and the responsibility. And Paul Ehrlich, who's a very famous ecologist, a lot of you may know his name, you know, he's just written about this all the time, that, you know, we can't just hide out in our ivory towers. We've got to put the information out there. So I think science is great, but I think we can do a lot better job. So what are some of the problems animals face? I want to just roll through and then conclude. Well, in all countries, animals are considered to be property under the law, okay, like objects. There's very, very few laws that protect animals, and even when there are, they're usually not enforced. I mean, let's just face it, you know, they're like on the books, but they're not really enforced. Another problem is that animals are what we would call non-consenting individuals. We don't really ask them, do you mind if we do X, Y, or Z? We just do it, okay? So they're non-consenting in their property, and that's a major problem. So some examples that I was talking about before, good welfare. These are just all real things. So castrating pigs without anesthetic, is that good welfare? Is starving rats good welfare? Is blinding cats good welfare? Is injecting a disease into a chimpanzee good welfare? So I'm just running this through, okay? Once again, these are questions that people just have to ponder. There's going to be different answers. Some will go yes, some will go no, some will go maybe. But the questions aren't going to go away if we ignore them. And they're difficult questions, okay? People will go, well, I don't really like the idea of, you know, blinding a cat, but if it helps humans, then that's okay. I'm not saying, you know, that I feel that way. Or, well, I don't care if we starve rats if it helps us learn about eating disorders in humans, okay? So I'm just saying that there's lots of different arguments out there, but I think we need to ask these questions. But when I say that good welfare isn't good enough, it's supported by hard data. It's not like because I'm some, you know, fuffball from Boulder. It's because this was in 2007, so the 5 years before that, violations of the Federal Animal Welfare Act increased over 90%. In 2006, there were 2,100 reported violations. Lord knows how many there may have been that weren't reported. And about 75% of all laboratories, this is in the continental US, violate the federal law, okay? I mean, these are real numbers, okay? So is good welfare good enough? Is when one of your colleagues or my colleague says, well, we're doing the best we can and we're following what's allowed under the Animal Welfare Act. Well, the Animal Welfare Act does not protect 99% of all animals who are used in research. Mice and rats, other rodents, and birds and fish and invertebrates are not protected, okay? And really, if you do the numbers, it's about 98 to 99% of all animals used in invasive research are not protected. Well, what about mice? Well, we now know that they're empathic. So we know that hard neurobiological science showed that mice are empathic. Has that been factored into any amendment of the Animal Welfare Act? What do you think? Thank you. No. Here's an interesting piece of data. I didn't know this until I wrote my last book, is that about 106 or more thousand people die each year in hospitals from adverse reactions to drugs. If it had to be reported systematically, it would be the second leading cause of death in hospitals. It gives you something to take pause. But this is what's amazing, that 92 out of every 100 drugs that pass animal tests fail during human clinical trials, according to the FDA. So once again, these are hard numbers. What a waste of animals. And even if you didn't care about the animals, what a waste of money and time for developing remedies and drugs that could help in human disease. So animals do have a point of view. This is one of my favorites. Someone gave me this. This is Michael Vick's jersey. We all know about Mr. Vick. So some questions. Horses. What's happening to these horses? I get a lot of emails that are coming anonymous from almost, sites I can't respond back to about abuse in horse racing. I just get a lot of them. I don't know much about it. I imagine it does happen, but, once again, you've seen this slide. I mean, what are these animals feeling? What is this lynx who had just been kidnapped, if you will, in Canada, thrown into a cage, taken to Colorado, stressed? What are they thinking and what are they feeling? And how can anybody think that they're going to be successfully reintroduced into a habitat where the food supply was marginal, which is why a whole lot of them starved to death? Where's the ice? I mean, polar bears are drowning. They follow traditional routes, they jump in the water, and they get stranded. Okay, once again, I mean, of course, it's a tragedy in and of itself, but what's going through the minds of these animals? What's going through the mind of a mother polar bear when she's swimming with her babies and she realizes that she ain't making it? And they do realize that. So before I end off with a couple of slides of animal use around the world and some work I do in China, I'm just going to go through this section really rapidly. Not because it's not important, but I think I'll make the point really fast, is I like to think about not what we eat and what we wear, but who we eat and who we wear. And animals are whos, they're not whats. So if somebody has dinner and they say, what's for dinner? I always go, well, no, who's for dinner? And it really makes people feel uncomfortable. And I'm not doing it to be a nasty man. I'm just saying, well, they're whos. They're subjects of a life. They have self-awareness. They are sentient. And they're not objects like, this table. Okay? So who we eat or who we wear is a moral act. These are happy pigs. That's your bacon, sausage, and ham. Is it surprising kids don't know that when they're eating a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, they're eating a Babe lettuce and tomato sandwich? And when kids discover that, they're absolutely upset about it. They really are. I've been with kids who have discovered that, and they are beside themselves. Battery hens, battery cages. I know, I just have to show this. Julia Child. I mean, this is obscene. I gave a talk recently about battery cage birds. That's a real battery cage. That's what it really looks like. Happy cows in a slaughterhouse. And one of my favorite, but definitely most disappointing quotes is a slaughterhouse worker saying they die piece by piece. There was just a recent study published out of the University of Windsor in Canada that showed that in areas where there are slaughterhouses, local crime increases. It's very interesting. This is not a judgment on the slaughterhouse workers. It's a fact of how hard their lives are. I've been told that upwards of 90% of all people who work in slaughterhouses get counseling. So it's a horrific job. It's a horrific job for humans, and it's horrific for the animals. One thing that always gets me is if you're an environmentalist, this is from a cover from E! Magazine that a lot of you know. It says, so if you're an environmentalist, basically how can you eat meat? So even if you don't care about animals, what about the environmental destruction? Like pig farms have just destroyed the east coast of North Carolina. I went to a conservation meeting and they had a barbecue and hamburgers, and a whole bunch of us went out there and said, we can't eat this. We're not trying to be jerks. we don't eat this, so they went out and got veggie burgers, and everybody wanted veggie burgers. So it's just something, once again, it's like, how do you reconcile interests in individuals and ecosystems and populations? How do you reconcile the fact that you're working for habitat preservation, you're working for the land, and you then eat meat from slaughterhouses that destroy the land and the atmosphere? You all know about, cows fart a lot, and they put out methane. In New Zealand, cow gas accounts for more than 50% of the methane in the air right now. That's a lot. So, I mean, it's just these kinds of things that I think we need to, fess up that make us feel uncomfortable. Use of animals. I work in China a bunch, and they did kill dogs. They were shooting them on the street, literally, as people were walking them to control the rabies. And I've seen this in Chengdu, where I go. These are cats on the way to market. So I tell people, I go to China, and they'll go, isn't that where they eat cats and dogs? And I go, yes, and I just flew over from America where they eat pigs and cows. And it's quiet. And they go, oh, interesting. So I'm just saying that, let's face up, cows and pigs are no less sentient than dogs and cats. This was a cow I met in India. The people loved the cow. This cow was out 24/7 in 100-degree Fahrenheit heat. And finally, I was with a group, and we were at an animal protection meeting, and I said, we need to ask the people, can we give the cow water? I didn't want to just do it and be, that old, big, old, white, ugly American who does these things. So we went into the house, someone spoke English, and they were wonderful. They said, well, of course you can give her water, but she's fine. So it just made me think, who am I to do this? And their view of the cow was she was just fine, being tethered by a rope that was about less than a meter. This was a black bear outside of Minneapolis who got his head stuck in a plastic jar, and he was shot. He was emaciated and dehydrated, and the Division of Wildlife, or whatever they call it up in Minnesota, said, we shot him because he was a danger to humans. And so I got on the phone and really pressed them, and they said, well, we couldn't find a veterinarian to tranquilize him. Well, it turns out my friend lives about a mile from where this bear was shot, and he's a wildlife vet. So I'm just saying, you just can't go kill animals. This is legal, keeping baboons in vices, that's legal. These are good welfare. You're allowed to do this. So let me end off with some of the work I do, because it'll be a story that some of you don't know about. I do a lot of work with a group called Animals Asia, my t-shirt, and they rescue moon bears who have a crest across them from the bear bile industry. This rivals, or could be worse than factory farming. So I'll just run through the story, because I'm going to end off on a real positive note, because I am an optimist, and I want you to, I hope you can share my optimism. So this is Haley. She's about 5'6". That's the cage that Franzi lived in. And this is me feeding Franzi. She just died a few months ago. This is how tall she was. She was kept in that cage for 25 years. 25 years, not seconds or hours or days or months, but years. All for her bile. This is me feeding Jasper. I met him on Match.com. No, I'm only kidding. Jasper's my favorite bear. When I go to China, we hang out, and you can see the crest. Okay? That's Jasper. That's Jasper in what's called a crush cage. The top of the cage gets pushed down to squeeze on his abdomen. There's a catheter into his gallbladder to get his bile. Jasper was in this cage for 15 years, and all he could move was his head. Okay? And there's many substitutes for bile. All the bears who are rescued, about 230 or 60 now, I'm not quite sure, suffer from enormous physical malformities, cancer, psychologically really, really messed up. And this is Jasper now. So I show it just because what it does for me is it makes me think, once again, coming back to the question of who these other animals are and how we treat them. Okay, Jasper lived in a cage like this on the side for 15 years. Jasper has flashbacks, we know that. But Jasper also, he breaks up fights and he welcomes other bears into the rescue center. He's the one bear who basically comes to his name. So the question I'm interested in, it's sort of a behavioral question, it's a question about who these other animals are, is, what can we learn from animals? What do they teach us? I mean, why should Jasper have any faith in any human being? But somehow he's gotten through it and, if you will, forgives us. He basically he's okay. It took a long time to get him there. And this is Jasper on his hammock. So I just want to, to end with a few, things because, Jasper really rekindles me every time I see him either in bear or, when we email, we Skype. And so, what is it about an animal who can go through what he went through and forgive, welcome other bears in, break up fights? So what it makes me think about, and I'm just going to, end off with, some things that I feel about the world, is that, really think is what I said when I started the talk, is that we have really been duped and co-opted by, if you will, a competitive model of nature. Nature red in tooth and claw. I mean, I think we've really been blanked by that because we really, really tend to adhere to that. So we accept all the bad things. But I've been doing a lot of work now with a psychologist. His name is Dacha Keltner, and he's at the University of California in Berkeley. And 2 years ago, he wrote a book called Born to be Good. And Dacha contacted me when he was writing the book about my work on coyotes, where I showed that fairness in coyotes really pays off. You don't want to be labeled a cheater. You don't want to be a coyote living on your own, blah, 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 blah. And then I realized when I read Born to be Good that where Dacha writes about humans, I could substitute animals, realizing that humans are animals. And when I wrote about animals in my book, The Animal Manifesto, he could be writing about humans. So Dacha and I have been working because we're not fluffballs. He's in Berkeley, so not like Boulder. I mean, Boulder is grounded compared to Berkeley. I mean, but some people say, oh God, a guy from Boulder and a guy from Berkeley are working together. This is a disaster. but the fact of the matter is that I really think that if you look at the data, like I told you before about the data that Bob Sussman and his colleagues collected, and how rare it really is to see these battles to the death in animals. Yes, they happen. But you know what no one's ever done? I've actually done this, and Bob Sussman did it, is look at the comparison in the frequencies or the rates of amicable, or what we call prosocial positive interactions compared to real divisive negative ones, okay? The scale's like this. So where I return is, people say, well, what are you going to do about it? Or not me necessarily. So here's what I think we ought to do. I think that we need to be really positive and just use and focus on what works and not what doesn't work. Okay, some people will say not a lot works. Well, if you can find something that works, work. And really be positive. Don't spend a lot of time sulking or feeling sorry for yourself. It doesn't get you there. Don't spend a lot of time battling the critics. Like if someone says to me, I don't know if dogs have emotions, let's debate it. I'm going, why would I debate that? I'd rather go out and protect animals than debate you. So I know people get upset about that, but I think that sometimes you just have to choose your battles and just let something go. So there are certain people that I'm just not going to waste my time on. Do I wish that they would have another feeling or view? Yes. Are they going to? No. So I think we need to be positive, and we need to be compassionate to other people. You can't fight fire with fire. I know sometimes you just want to rip someone else apart when they want to rip you apart, but then what you're doing is you're feeding into their game. You just are. You're playing their game, and when that happens, you might as well go home, because once one person is on the defensive, you've lost. You might as well just go home, okay? And we need to be proactive. And that's one of the things I think about, like, not only from the scientific point of view, but we know what's happening out there to animals and to habitats, to landscapes. I mean, we just, and to people, of course. We know this. So we need to stop always being reactive and putting out fires. So I think that if we are proactively compassionate, we can really make a difference in the world. And that's not trying to be overly sentimental. It's just trying to show you that a lot of the strategies that we've used in the past just haven't worked. Because if they worked, we wouldn't be screwed like we are now. So we might as well have a paradigm shift. And that's why I was saying before that I really believe, I travel a lot, and yes, I see horrible things, but there really is genuine goodness out there. I mean, I have a whole section of another talk where I just run through the continents of all these amazing people doing amazing things for animals and the environment. So I'm just going to end with that. I don't want to be preachy, but I'm just going to say that I really believe that we really need to tap into how good we are and flip the coin around and go from there. And that's how we'll expand what I call our compassion footprint. So thank you for listening. Sure. Any
There's like
questions?
5 minutes, so.
I don't care. I don't have a plane till tomorrow morning. Sir.
So a few questions, you can fill them.
Okay, I'll field them. Okay?
How do you think our wildlife feels having a collar around their neck 24/7? We call it wolves, we call it lions, we call it bears. Do you think it's overdone?
The question is, what do you think animals feel like, carrying collars? Well, there have been some studies done with that. So from the scientific point of view, in certain rodents, if you put a collar on that's more than 10% of their body weight, they may not like it, but it actually affects dominance relationships. So you're not really collecting reliable data, okay? I'm just showing this. Tim Cairo, who studied, Joel, help me, what animals did he put collars on? If it weighs less than 10, is it hyenas? No, lions. Anyway, there's a carnivore, and I'm drawing a blank, that he actually looked at the effect of collars of different weights, and when the weight of the collar was under a certain amount of grams, it didn't change their behavior, okay? Now, you can maybe use that as a barometer for wondering whether the animals, care or not, or how they're responded to. I mean, that's all I can tell you. I mean, I think there are individual differences. In the elephants, they put on these enormous, the satellite transmitter itself could be half the size of this box with a collar that's huge. It doesn't seem to affect their behavior at all. So what I'm saying is maybe you can get a feeling for what the animals are feeling about wearing a collar from having before and after data, okay? In terms of over-collaring, yeah, I think at some point we just need to, if we're reintroducing animals or watching animals, we just have to put them out there and just let them be without collars.
You mentioned that all animals are sentient, but there are differences in the degree. And I'm wondering what areas have the greatest disparities, and what are some kinds of animals that are more evolutionarily advanced?
Yeah, I want to be careful to say I didn't really say that all animals are sentient, okay? I mean, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I don't know about mosquitoes, for example. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But I think that, across mammals, birds, there was just a book written, it just came out about 2 months ago, called Do Fish Feel Pain by an award-winning woman scientist named Virginia Braithwaite. And she summarizes the data, and it's just very, very clear that fish feel pain. So the question you're asking might be like a question, where do you draw the line, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I honestly don't know. But what I'd rather concentrate on is when, like if I say, okay, dogs are sentient, or wolves are sentient, or, birds. And some critics will say, oh, I suppose you think that mosquitoes are sentient, and they try to get the argument to discuss mosquitoes, right? No, I'd rather discuss what we know, and then let's discover mosquitoes, okay? And the other question, in terms of more or less sentient, I think it's a really good question. I'm not sure how to answer it because not only is, I think, sentience maybe species specific or related, but individually related. So I don't want to say that if I have a lower threshold to pain than you do, I'm more sentient. But I think individuals express it differently. So it's a great question you're asking, and I think that, like the data that came out on empathy in mice from some really hardcore studies, are really expanding the range of animals, not only in terms of who are sentient, but who experience different types of emotions. Thanks for asking. It's a good question. Yeah?
I have a question. Do you think that there are ways that people could become more aware of feeling, emotion, state of being kinds of issues? And the reason I ask is, I happen to be one of the individuals that have Asperger's syndrome. That's a form of autism. So my state of being is actually somewhat more related to the feeling and the intuition and the emotion. And I also happen to be one of those autistic individuals that actually does have the physically heightened senses. So what would be your answer to that?
And so tell me, ask me your question again.
Do you have any ideas about how people could become more aware of the, I would call it the emotional intelligences or the feeling / state of being?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one way, I mean, one easy way is, I always say to people, you know, if you live with a dog or a cat, pay more attention to your animal and then expand that knowledge or those feelings to other animals. The other is just to experience animals, just be with them. I think it's a great question because I think one of the things that happens is as people get really busy lives and they move away out of nature, I wrote a paper called Old Brains in New Bottlenecks, and we have old brains in new bottlenecks, sociocultural milieus. We're busy. We don't have time to go out. We don't have time to do this. But our old brains don't care. And I think what's happening for a lot of people, your question's a great one, is the rubber band stretches and we get pulled back. You know, people, when you're out of sorts, you know, personally about something, you go take a walk in nature, you hear a bird sing, see a butterfly, you pet a dog and you feel good about it. And I think what's happening for a lot of people is the rubber band is stretching and it's really pulling the brain, if you will, away from what's natural in terms of our sort of Pleistocene brain. For some people it snaps. So I think that having direct experience of animals, either on a companion animal with whom you live or going and taking a walk, is a really good way to do it. Does that answer your question? Yeah. It's you know, I just read some data. I don't know where it was, but most adults, and I don't know where the study was done, it could be, you know, just in North America, spend, I don't know, it was a frightening low percentage of their waking time outside, other than, you know, walking to their car to go to work or something like that. No, it was really, really frightening, the low number. So get out, you know. No, I mean, get off your butts and get out. I mean, because really, I think people are just, I mean, life is complex. It's a tough time. But invariably and across cultures, people will tell you they feel better when they are outside in nature. And I think it's our old shared brains, you know, because we're all Homo sapiens, except maybe politicians. Anyway, sure. Yeah. Oh, there's two more. Okay, Anja, and then you. Yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've been on the road for the last 2 months, traveling across Montana, talking to people, gathering signatures for our Montana Trap-Free Public Lands Initiative, I-160, and I find the mindset very prevalent. People thinking that we're so different from animals, and I also find it that this is very religious, motivated by religious belief. And I'm at a loss as to how to tackle that, because the reference is usually, well, it's in the Bible. Well, the Lord said, Jesus said, whatever, and I'm not sure how to tackle that. Maybe you have some ideas, suggestions?
Is there another question? I didn't come to Montana for that.
The reason I'm asking is because you
No,
can't really
no,
fight
you know-
religious belief with biology.
No,
So-
no, it's a good question. We talked about that this morning at breakfast. One way, what I do is I give talks in churches, for example, or other houses of worship. And I give a talk like this. I just do. I put it out there, and you put it out there, and you just let people make up their own mind. There's going to be certain views, whether you are pro or con religion, it doesn't matter, that are going to be very, very difficult to either to modify or eradicate. And that would be a good example, because if people are really highly religious and that's what they feel and that's what they believe, more power to them. There's nothing I can do about it. Move on to other people. I really, and I know that some people think it's a cop-out, but my goodness gracious, you can just spend your whole life trying to change one person instead of just a whole crew of people. And sometimes it's just giving up. And if people want to think I'm a quitter, I'm a quitter. But sometimes you just have to go, I just can't do this anymore.
Mark, can I respond to Anya just very briefly?
You can do anything you want.
Steve Kaufman,
Okay, make it quick, though, because we have a question and another respondent.
Vegetarian Association online. Steve Kaufman's books, there
Yeah.
are people that write about that. Get those books, read them, you'll have all sorts of answers for the Christians.
Yeah, I do a lot of work with theologians, some of whom have very strong, very doctrinaire, if you will. But, once again, it's putting it out there. And so I gave a talk, actually, to a church group, and I could tell people felt uncomfortable. So what I did was I just changed my talk, and I started talking about dogs. And the first question I asked was, how many people in this room live with a companion dog or cat? And probably 80% of the hands went up. And I said, great, let's not talk about moon bears, let's not talk about elephants, let's not talk about empathic mice, let's talk about dogs. And you could tell that as I was talking about the dogs, they were beginning to tune in. I'm not going to say that that's going to override their religious beliefs, but at least you're making them think. Or not making them in a coercive way, but you're asking them to think.
What would you offer up as guiding principles or some type of help for making decisions about spreading resources out? I'm thinking specifically what I've experienced where there's some in say, humane organizations dealing with domestic animals, where there's certain sets of people who will put a lot of resources into a very few animals, and there's another set of people who think, well, we can spread that out and socialize 20 dogs, say, instead of taking care of the two sick ones, and get them adopted and get them a home. And what do you offer to people to help work their way through that?
That is a great question. So, published a paper last year on the work with the moon bears, and one of the questions at the end was, when I say we, I make donations, but I put a lot of time and energy, should we be putting our time into rehabilitating some of these animals who are really at death's door, or trying to do other things, right? That's what you're asking. It's almost a numbers game. And I don't know, one of the thought experiments that philosophers like to use, I use it, but it came from the philosophical literature. It's called the dog in the lifeboat. What it is, you've got 3 humans and a dog in the lifeboat, and the lifeboat can only support 3 beings, okay? So the first iteration would be, well, if you have to throw one individual over, who should it be? And a lot of people say the dog. Why the dog? Well, the dog doesn't have a family who will miss him or her. The dog won't suffer as much, etc. Well, when I do this with kids, and I've done this probably in 15 countries, and I lay it out across the board, and that's why I'm so happy to work with kids, because they're the ambassadors for the future. They'll go, oh, well, why do you have to throw anyone over? Why can't a dog and then a person swim, next to the boat, okay? What I'm getting to is, so what happens if one of those individuals in the boat is, say, a 100-year-old man who is on life support and you've got a young puppy, okay? Who would you choose to throw over if you had to? Well, if you might choose to throw over the older person who would be unaware, okay, of what's happening. I'm just throwing that out because it's a really great question that it comes up a lot. You know, when you have limited resources and time, energy, and money, should we, I'm just saying this, have put all this time and effort into saving Jasper when really he would have died peacefully, you know? I mean, he was in pain but under anesthetic, and go off and put that money into saving 300 other bears? I'm not sure. And I mean, I appreciate your question because it's how we dole out our resources. You know, so the way I like to operate is that every individual counts, okay? And then when do you make a decision? I mean, we make this for people all the time. My family had to make it for my mom. When did we just not treat her anymore after being, 8 years basically in a coma? We just had to say, enough's enough. So I don't know how you make that. You know, utilitarians, if you're just a good hardcore utilitarian, you would say, well, if that amount of money could save 300 bears that you put into saving one, let Jasper die a merciful, dignified death and put the money in. I don't know. It's a no. Oh no. And no. But I'm just saying I agree with you because then you look at an animal like Jasper, and he's one of many who recouped, and you go, well, my goodness, look at the life he had, and he suffered interminably. He had no idea that he was going to be released, blah, 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 blah. And then you look at him and you go, well, how could you not have taken care of him? But then go back to, like when I was there 2 years, or about a year and a half ago, and all these bears came in, and I mean, really, some of them, they're out cold. They are either in so much pain and they've passed out, or they're just in comas, right? And we would make the attribution, if it were a human, that they would not have known if you just gave them an overdose of something to, like if you put a dog to sleep, and then people fight with that all the time. Should we be doing this when we've got, the example with the bears might be, well, you've got this bear who is just really, the chances of this bear living are really low, but we've had 6 bears over here who we know will make it. What do we do? Maybe that's where religion comes in. I mean, no, seriously, I don't know.
Maybe Jasper is the ambassador for raising consciousness about saving the others.
Exactly, right, or Jasper, yeah, and he is in many ways, right, that's a really good, there was a bear named Andrew who, the Chinese government is just horrific on this. They're corrupt, they steal money, they're in with the bear farmers. But in order to placate some of the people, they kind of adopted a bear named Andrew. He died a few years ago, so Andrew was the ambassador, if you will, for the rescue center outside of Chengdu. I mean, but that's just another thing, is because, they tell you the money's coming in. It doesn't come in, Anyway, be positive. No.